you're looking at inflation, we're taking into account anticipated and unanticipated inflation. We'd like to know which is worse for, say, society as a whole. Well, it's not necessarily to say that one is worse, but which one might pose the greater threat to society? Which one might pose a greater problem? So let's first analyze anticipated inflation. Now, anticipated inflation is often seen as good. And the reason it's seen as a good form of inflation is because people can prepare for it, right? We like to prepare, we as humans. We don't like to be caught off guard. So by allowing us to prepare for this inflation, we can better borrow, we can better lend, right? Because interest rates are affected by both of these. So we can anticipate those interest rates as well, because interest rates and inflation also tend to move together. They're affected by one another. So if we can anticipate what inflation is, we can also anticipate what interest rates are, and thus we can be smarter borrowers and smarter lenders, right? We can also, as maybe employers, we can adjust our wages so that we can adjust for any increases in price levels, okay? As manufacturers, that's where price levels comes in. We can anticipate what levels are going to be increasing, how price is going to be changing over the course of the next whatever time period we're working with, and we can adjust our price levels accordingly. And as consumers, we can buy a little bit smarter, right? If we anticipate 10% inflation, well, maybe we're going to cut back on our spending, or maybe we're not, because if we're smart, we know that anticipating inflation, we can also anticipate an increase in our nominal incomes by the same amount. So anticipating inflation allows us to anticipate all of these other factors, since inflation is kind of wrapped up in all of it, right? Now, on the other hand, unanticipated inflation, this kind of catches us off guard, right? It's a bit of a surprise. And we don't necessarily like that, right? As humans, like I said before, we like to be prepared. Now, unanticipated inflation tends to jolt our salaries. All of a sudden, our spending is all off. Our incomes are not necessarily what they should be, right? Because nominal incomes and inflation should increase proportionately, but all of a sudden, if inflation hits seemingly out of nowhere, our incomes haven't had time to adjust. And the same thing goes for borrowing and lending. Our interest rates haven't adjusted. And so all of a sudden, everything is kind of thrown off kilter just because we weren't ready for it. So in this case, I would like to say that anticipated inflation is the better one. So I suppose to answer the question, the one being worse is the unanticipated inflation. But keep in mind that when we anticipate inflation, if we are wrong about it, we adjust everything and may cause inflation itself. If inflation is not doomed to happen, and yet we anticipate it as if it is going to happen, we ourselves increase price levels and increase wages. So keeping in mind how our anticipations as rational beings, right? Economics assumes that we as humans are rational decision makers. Well, if our rational decisions, as far as we're concerned, are actually incorrect, we may indirectly and without meaning affect the economy as a whole, right? But for the purpose of this question, let's say that unanticipated inflation is worse than anticipated inflation.